Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, April 28th, 2025, and I'm the host of the show, Dr. Cara Santa Maria. And as always, like the broken record I am, I want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible week after week. Remember, Talk Nerdy isn't will always be 100% free to download. And the way that we keep this in production is by relying on the support of individuals just like you. If you'd like to pledge your support on an episodic basis, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com, that's patreon.com/talknerdy. This week's top patrons include Anu Bharadwaj, Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, David Compton, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, Joe Wilkinson, Joseph Lamore, Pasquale Gelati, Rika Maharaj, and Ulrika Hagman. Thank you all so much. So this week I had the honor of speaking with Dr. John B. King Jr. He served in President Barack Obama's cabinet as the 10th U.S. Secretary of Education. He has also worked kind of across so many different aspects of public education, including as a high school social studies teacher, a middle school principal. He was the first African American and Puerto Rican individual to serve as New York State Education Commissioner. He's also been a college professor and the president and CEO of the Education Trust, which is a national education civil rights organization. Currently, Dr. King is the chancellor of the State University of New York, also known as SUNY, which is, of course, the nation's largest comprehensive system of public higher education. And he wrote a wonderful book called Teacher by Teacher: The People Who Change Our Lives. So without any further ado, here he is, the former U.S. Secretary of Education, Dr. John B. King Jr. Well, John, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. I'm excited to talk with you.
I am too. I'm really excited about your new book, Teacher by Teacher: The People Who Change Our Lives. So before we even get into the book, and the reasons for writing the book, I want to talk a little bit about your background, which I know is getting into the book because this is kind of pseudo-memoir. You served as the 10th U.S. Secretary of Education. So you were in Obama's cabinet. A lot of life happened to get you to that place, and a lot of life has happened since. But of course, probably if somebody were to think of your name or to Google you, that might be the first thing that comes to mind. And I would love if you could share with us in this, I don't know, moment of turmoil that many of us are experiencing right now, what does the Secretary of Education do, and why is the Department of Education so important?
Sure. Well, I think about the department's work in really three buckets. One is funding for vulnerable students in K-12. The Title I program that sends money to schools serving low-income students, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act funding, which provides services for students with disabilities, funding for English learners, all of that work to both get those dollars to districts and to provide guidance and support to districts in serving vulnerable students. That's one bucket of work. The second is financial aid for higher education. So the Pell Grant program and the student loan program, those together really make it possible for low and middle income students to afford college and have played a vital role in the success of the American economy because they help prepare the workforce that we need. And then the third bucket of work is around civil rights enforcement and really data transparency. So it's the place where if you've experienced discrimination based on race or gender or religion, you would go to get help. It's also the place where we keep track of how we're doing and where students are succeeding and where they're struggling and whether groups of students are struggling in particular places. All of that work, I think, is a national imperative. And it's one of the reasons I'm so distressed by the assault on the department. We are only as strong as our education system, whether you're talking about our economy or you're talking about our national security. And we need national leadership to make sure that we are serving students as well as we can. In some ways, the education secretary functions like the Surgeon General for education. It's the person who has a bully pulpit to be able to talk about the educational needs of our students. I was very privileged to do that with a president who cared deeply about education personally and made it a priority to invest in education.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, we will not spend much time in the despairing part of what we're looking at today. But I just have to kind of respond or reiterate that I too am very distressed because most of the initiatives or the imperatives that you just mentioned are fundamental to the goals of the Department of Education, are in direct opposition to the ideology of those in power right now. Like they're the very things that those in power right now want to dismantle, which is terrifying. As you mentioned, education is not only fundamental to a thriving economy and so many other aspects of a functional, I don't know, nation. It's
Mm-hmm.
necessary. It's necessary for an informed citizenry. It's necessary for a voting public. Like if we are not educated as people, we do not know how to vote in our own best interests, and we make decisions that really affect us negatively in the future. We
100%.
yeah, we are more
100%.
likely to vote for authoritarian leaders if we are not educated.
Yes, that's for sure true. And look, I started out as a social studies and civics teacher. I think a crucial role of education is helping people understand how to function successfully in community. It's how they're going to vote at the on federal issues, but it's also like how are you going to deal with local issues in your community? When there needs to be a new traffic light at an intersection, what do you do about that? Who do you talk to? How do you talk to them? How do you live in community in a healthy way with people who have different views than you?
Yeah.
Like all of those habits are things that you develop in school.
You mentioned before that a huge imperative of the Department of Education is funding, especially for higher education, and especially for those individuals who are more vulnerable, who may not have the means, and that applies to many people in today's economic landscape, but who may not have the means to be able to easily pursue higher education, but who are equally as deserving as anyone else. And I think part of the reason that your story is so relevant, it to me personally, is I too pursued higher education and I too took advantage of many of these educational programs when I was both in primary through secondary school, but also in higher education. But you yourself were not one of these kind of what we think of as a politician who came from money, who was able to just kind of make any decision possible and and go get an education because you were a legacy, student. Like you yourself struggled and required that same kind of support that you later fought for in your role.
100%. I mean, that's really what's defined my whole career, trying to, make sure that other kids have the kinds of opportunities and support that I had. You know, when I was a kid, I lost both my parents when I was little. My mom when I was 8, my dad when I was 12. In the period when it was just my dad and me, my dad was struggling with Alzheimer's. So home was incredibly difficult and scary and unstable. And the thing that saved me was school, public school, New York City public schools, PS 276 in Canarsie and Mark Twain Junior High School in Coney Island. And the teachers I had in those schools who created a space that was safe and supportive and nurturing. And truly, if not for them, I wouldn't be alive today. I certainly wouldn't have the opportunities that I've had in my career. So when I think about what it means if we lose something like the Title I program, teachers who would be laid off, advanced placement classes that would be canceled, class sizes that would grow, that would be terrible.
I take a moment sometimes to step back and try to look at the forest for the trees. My mother she's retired now, but was also an educator for her entire career. She taught middle school Spanish in Plano, Texas, where I grew up. And the way that she poured everything into this job that was in many ways incredibly thankless from an administrative perspective. It was incredibly fulfilling for her from an emotional psychological perspective, but my mother never made that much money. My mother always was overworked. She was constantly getting sick, right? She taught middle school, so she was always coming home with some sort of bug and having to fight that. The fact that there are so many brilliant and dedicated educators out there, in spite of the fact that the system doesn't do enough to support them, that it's always just underfunded, that there's always, basically work for free that every teacher I've ever met does. And that we want to, not we, but that the current administration wants to defund that even further, deprioritize that even further. It's going to collapse. There's just no way that anybody can afford to survive, to put food on their table. I mean, they're barely getting by as it is in a functional system.
Oh, that's exactly right. And we should be having a conversation about how do we pay teachers more?
Right.
How do we make it easier for someone to choose teaching? Like, providing scholarships so that folks who commit to teach in high needs communities or in hard to staff subject areas like math and science, get scholarships that will help them make it through school. We should be having a conversation about intensive tutoring and how we help the students who are still behind from the COVID disruptions catch up. We're not talking about any of that right now. And that's one of the tragic things here, is that as we have a national debate about dismantling the education department, we're so far from grappling with the real issue.
Absolutely. I mean, literally, the conversations right now are these like red herring, super depressing conversations about DEI hires, these like wild reverse racism claims that are just ideologically driven and not at all, based in reality. It must be heartbreaking for you to kind of watch that from the position that you were once in, and the position that you're in now too, but to watch what is happening to that department that you put your heart and soul into.
It's really painful. And I think about some of the career civil servants at the department, people who were teachers, principals themselves, who've given, in some cases, decades of service to the country and to the education sector, and they're being treated so horribly. And there's a cruelty and a callousness of the approach that's been taken so far that's so deeply troubling. And it's not partisan, Margaret Spellings, who was Secretary of Education for George W. Bush, we disagree on a bunch of things, but we both believe in the role that public education plays, believe that we should be trying to improve outcomes for all students, believe we should be frustrated by gaps in performance for low income students and students of color, and we should be working to close those gaps, believe that the people who work in government deserve to be treated with respect and dignity and have their experience valued. So this is different. This moment sort of transcends uh, traditional partisan questions. This is really about a very dark view of how society should function.
And one thing that I think might be beneficial here on the show, and I can't speak to the inner workings of the machinations of the minds of those who listen to Talk Nerdy. I know that this show that I host, I've been hosting for over a decade now. It is a show that focuses mostly on science and social justice. But I don't know, I may have some listeners who are exposed to these different views and these different opinions, who are listening to some of the rhetoric that's out right now, and they're saying, okay, that sounds like a reasonable argument, or this DEI stuff, maybe I should take another look at it. I don't know. My assumption is that most of my listeners are like, what is happening? This is so terrifying. But maybe there are a handful of folks who are being convinced by some of the rhetoric that they're hearing coming out of a place of power. I myself think about this famous quote from the evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould. For me, this is the thing that brings into the light why we need social justice programs and why we need things like diversity, equity, inclusion. He said, I am somehow less interested in the weight and convolutions of Einstein's brain than in the near certainty that people of equal talent have lived and died in cotton fields and sweatshops.
Mm.
And to me, that hits home 100% why we need these kinds of programs. But I'm really curious, because you have been in a position where you have been expected to make these arguments, and you've been expected in rooms to help people understand why Title I, for example, is so fundamental to the health of a democracy. Maybe you can share with us, especially speaking to those who are going, I don't know, maybe DEI isn't so important. Maybe, Musk has a point over here. What would you say to an individual who's on the fence or who's slowly being convinced by the rhetoric that they're hearing right now?
I think two things. One, yeah, your point about uh, the talent we miss out on if we don't provide opportunity for everyone is so powerful. We can't really afford to leave talent on the sidelines. And when you think about international economic competitiveness, when you think about the scale of the challenges we face, how we're going to grapple with a changing environment, how we're going to grapple with a economy that's going to be changed dramatically by things like artificial intelligence. We can't afford to leave great thinkers and inventors on the sidelines because we didn't provide them with education. The other thing I'd say is, look, could things be better in government? Absolutely. Are there programs that could be more efficient? Sure. Are there excesses in service of principles of diversity, equity, inclusion, where people have uh, implemented ideas poorly? Of course, as is always the case. Like, that's the human condition. But then what we should do is we should fix those things. We should make them work better. This isn't, some surgical effort to make the education department work better. This is like swinging an axe wildly about without any rhyme or reason. And so I guess I would plead with people. Let's have a conversation about what's working and what isn't, and how we make it better. And we should bring politically diverse views to that table. But let's not accept a dark vision of what our society is, that we're just going to leave millions of Americans behind.
Absolutely. And in doing so, we know what would happen, right? We know that those individual teachers that you referenced, those teachers who saved you when you were in public school and who fostered a, a passion and a path for you to not only, I don't know, really fulfill your own ambitions, but give back in a really meaningful way to the entire citizenry, those teachers just won't be there anymore under this new leadership. So I'm curious about those teachers. Looking back to your time in elementary school, in secondary school, you are struggling with a type of loss that I don't think most people can comprehend. Many people go through horrific hardship. It's a small percentage of folks who lose their parents at a really young age. You lost both of them within a pretty short time frame. Can you tell us a little bit about that? How old were you again? I know you mentioned it, but when you first lost mom?
Yeah, my mom had a heart attack October of my fourth grade year. And she really had been the center of my home life because my father was much older. Um, Now, looking back, I understand that he may have already been in somewhat of cognitive decline even at that point. But I didn't understand any of that as an 8-year-old. So it was just me and my dad. And as my dad got more and more sick, home became more and more chaotic. I can remember one night, maybe I was in fifth grade, he woke me up 2 in the morning, told me it was time to go to school. And I remember saying to him, no, Daddy, it's not time to go to school. It's the middle of the night. And it was like he didn't understand. And eventually I was on the staircase in our house, just clinging to the banister as my father pulled me down the stairs. And I'm just insisting, it's not time to go to school. It's not time to go to school. And crying. And I didn't understand. And eventually he gave up and back to his room. And I went back to mine. And it was so disorienting. And that's what home was like night after night.
Well, and that's happening against the background of you mourning the loss of your mother as well. I mean, let's not forget that it's not just that she wasn't there anymore. You
Right.
She died.
Right. Yes.
What a
And so
tragedy that yeah, I mean, was the comfort there? Did you have other relatives? In this time, were you getting any mental health support?
it was the 80s. It wasn't so much of a thing.
Yeah,
My grandmother would come and visit on weekends. That was really helpful. But I felt incredibly alone.
yeah,
And school became like this safe haven, this place where I could escape from that. And I had a teacher in fourth, fifth, sixth grade. He looped with us, which is very unusual in New York City schools at that time. Mr. Osterwile, he was amazing. Uh, he was like Miss Frizzle in the Magic School Bus.
mhm.
He had us read the New York Times every day, took us on these amazing field trips to the Museum of Natural History and ballet, cloisters, and he uh, had us do theater productions that were so elaborate. We did A Midsummer Night's Dream, Shakespeare in elementary school. We did Alice in Wonderland, and I was the rose with big red felt petals sticking out of my head. And I remember those things so clearly because he made school this incredible adventure that was interesting and um, tapped into our curiosity. And that helped me make it through that period.
Yeah. Did he know? Did anybody know at school what you were going through?
No, he knew that my mom had passed. He knew her. She'd actually been a counselor at the elementary school when I was very little. But no one knew about my father being so sick and the decline, that eventually I was figuring out how to get food in our house, how to keep our household going. No, nobody knew that, but I didn't have language for what was going on. I, you know, I just thought my father was crazy. I didn't have a way to think about it. I didn't understand what Alzheimer's was or any of that. And I was embarrassed. I knew other people had more normal lives.
What ultimately happened? When did you lose dad?
There was one night where, when I was 12, my cousin came to stay at our house, maybe had a job interview or something. And in the middle of the night, my father fell. Like we heard a thud, and I woke up. My cousin woke up, went to see what happened, and my father had fallen. And we went to the emergency room. And when you have a head trauma, they ask you questions to see if you have a concussion. What day is it? Who's the president? That kind of thing. And he couldn't answer the question. But it wasn't because of the fall. It was because of the disease. And so he went into the hospital and stayed in the hospital for the next 3 months or so. I moved around different family members, and he passed away in the hospital that summer. And then it was the question like, well, where was I going to go? And I insisted on going to live with my older brother, who's 12 years older than me, living a wild partying life. He had no business having a 12-year-old. It was sweet of him, but he had no business having a 12-year-old to raise.
Yeah. How was that? Is that something you did? You actually did go with him?
Yeah.
Oh,
So
wow.
I lived with him. It was terrible. It was terrible.
Oh, no.
It was quite terrible. I'd had the experience of going to visit him at times.
Mm-hmm.
And that was like a fun, go to the movies, go bowling, go watch him play softball with his softball league, like eat at restaurants, which is like, it was so different from my day-to-day life with my father. And so that was very appealing.
Of course. And you were 12. That sounds like way more fun than going to live with grandma.
Yes. But then the reality of it was he drank all the time, partied a lot. He would take me bars, and I'd be like in the corner of the bar playing on the, like Pac-Man.
Yeah.
It was not a good situation. And I lived with him for 2 years, and it deteriorated over time. He was overwhelmed by having to take care of me. He wasn't sort of very together in his life. He got into this very difficult relationship, and that was very tumultuous. And yeah, it was not a good situation.
Where did you go after that? Because you were still a minor 2 years into that.
Yeah, so I decided, I had a friend from elementary school who had gone to a New England boarding school through one of these programs, that helps get low-income students from the city to these fancy boarding schools. And he was having a good experience. And so I thought, oh, well, this is my solution. I can get out of this terrible situation with my brother, and it sounds like it'll be a good academic environment. And I always loved academics in school. And so I went to Phillips Andover, which, is the boarding school that all the Bushes went to give you a sense of the kind of place. And I was extraordinarily out of place. And I struggled a lot there.
How did you pay for it?
My parents had both been New York City public school educators, so they, had pension money or whatever that was set aside.
So the money you didn't really have in life, you were able to get after their passings.
Yeah. And so then being there, this was a long time ago. I'm sure it is better now, but the school had really not created an environment that was supportive for the largely urban students of color who were coming to the school through these various programs. And I was really angry. Like many teenagers who've experienced trauma, I carried a lot of anger about the world, about my circumstances, about my parents. I was resentful of adult authority. I was also, going through this process of realizing, like, why is society so unjust, and why is there so much obvious racial tension on campus? And anyway, it did not go well. I got in a
How
lot of trouble.
so how old were you at this time? 14, 15?
Uh, yeah, 15, 16. Yeah,
So this is
yeah.
I do see that there is a certain subsection of young people who are like incredibly politically aware and politically active. But I think back to, so I'm sort of in between the generations, right? I was born in 83. I'm 41 years old right now. So I was in elementary school in like the 90s and
Mm-hmm.
uh, graduated high school 2001. I was not politically aware when I was 15. I was
Mm-hmm.
not like I'm just I feel like at the time you were probably having an awakening and an astuteness that a lot of your peers were just not even thinking about. It just wasn't on their radar. Like even if they were directly affected by it,
Mm-hmm.
even if they were, other kids of color who were experiencing abject sort of oppression and even overt sometimes racial discrimination. It's just like, well, that's just like how life is and it sucks and it's hard. But to be so politically aware at such a young age, it's interesting because it opens your mind in a really deep way, but it's also kind of a burden that you carry around with you. It does, like you said, you have a chip on your shoulder, you get angry.
Yes, yes, and I think having spent so much time alone, those years
Mm,
with my father and then even with my brother, I spent a lot of time in these difficult home situations where a refuge was to go in the room and read.
hmm
And, so I spent a lot of time reading things, like the autobiography of Malcolm X, right? Like things that really provoked a kind of critical stance towards society as I saw it. And I think that probably contributed to a very early sense of the kind of political significance of events.
Yeah. So then though, there's a stretch of time, right? You're having all of these experiences. And I feel like this is, I mean, not a common story, but it's a story I sometimes hear where an individual has all of these life experiences, is starting to develop a sense of awareness around, okay, I'm a member of this larger machine. This larger machine has a lot of systemic unjust practices, but I've got to function within my constraints. There's only so much money that I have access to. There's
Mm,
only so much opportunity that I have access to. I'm going to do what I can. Where does that translation occur? When do you start to find yourself digging deep down, finding the empowerment and learning how to kind of use whatever skills, that's not even the right word, but use what you can in front of you to say, okay, I think I'm going to go to college. When does the switch happen where you're no longer sort of subject to the machine, but you become object and are, kind of wanting to give back or to act within the machine?
the crossroads moment really came at a very low moment because
Mm,
I got in trouble at Andover repeatedly, and I got kicked
hmm
out.
Okay.
And I went to live with my aunt and uncle. My uncle was my father's youngest brother, and he had led this extraordinary life. So my uncle Hal was a Tuskegee Airman, one of the first black pilots in the U.S. military during World War II. Um, he came back from that experience, trained as an accountant, couldn't get a job as an accountant because of being a black man. And so he became a firefighter, which I always think is extraordinary, that his response to systemic discrimination was, let me go run into burning buildings to save
Yeah.
people. And then went back into the military, um, and was a career Air Force officer, and then ran a hospital and had a series of very significant public service jobs. And going to live with him was very instructive because he ran a tight ship. His wife,
I can
my Aunt
imagine.
Jean. So Uncle and Aunt Jean ran, dinner was the same time every night. There were strict rules. It was very different than anything I'd experienced since
Especially
I
the
was
living
eight.
with your older brother.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. It was a polar opposite. But he and I had a conversation about my getting kicked out of high school that really was transformative, where he said to me, neither you nor I can do anything about the things that have happened to you. But the question now is, what kind of man do you want to be? What kind of life do you want to have? And coming from him, given what he had endured and overcome, that was very powerful. And that really turned a switch where it changed my orientation to the world. Instead of being mad, I took more of an approach of like, what can I go do? How can I make it different?
And gosh, how important is it for young people who have experienced systematic, not just oppression, but systematic, maybe neglect, or just feeling passed over or feeling invisible within a system that doesn't privilege them? How empowering, how important is it to have somebody in your life who does speak about empowerment, who does talk about the idea that, like, no, you, like every other human being on this planet, are fundamentally worthwhile by virtue of being alive. And there are things that you can do and that you can experience and that you can engage with that will better yourself and better others around you. I think a lot of people, they just don't have access to even that mentality.
Oh, I think that's right. And it's one of the reasons I believe so deeply in not only the role of teachers, but the role of mentors. You know, when I was a high school teacher, I often think, one of the most important things of adolescence is there a person that a kid feels like they can trust and lean on and get guidance from? And it really only takes one. But some kids don't even have that one. And I find that when young people don't have that person in their lives, that is often when they get in trouble and they feel uh, rudderless.
Oh yeah,
Uh,
I so agree. I come at this from the perspective of not an educator, although I have worked a bit in education. I'm a clinical psychologist, and my parallel to that, and I mostly work with adults. I'm not a child psychologist. I mostly actually work with older adults in a cancer setting. But what I find very often when engaging in psychotherapy is is a parallel. Sort of discovery. And I hold on to this now when sort of my eyes were open to it, which is that it's deeply important to me in therapy to validate and to identify individuals' worth and value separate from their sort of capitalist standing, separate from their accomplishments, separate from their ability to earn money, but to identify the things about my patients that are fundamentally valuable and worthy, and to highlight them, to just constantly validate and empower. Because I learned, one day there was an aha moment where I discovered this person may not have anyone else in their entire life
hmm
that holds up that kind of mirror to them. I may be the only human being that they talk to who tells them how much they matter.
That's right. That's absolutely right.
And it's
I think,
heartbreaking, but it's true, right?
but it's true. It's true. I think sometimes about this survey that I saw once that was done. I think it was a subset of high schools, maybe in Los Angeles, and they asked the students if they could name someone who would in their school who would be proud of them. And I thought it was such a good question, right? Because you have to know someone and care about them to be proud of them. It was a great way to get at, like, is there someone who knows you and values you? And the thing that was heartbreaking is the percentage was incredibly low of students who could name someone at their school who would be proud of them.
And it is heartbreaking, and it doesn't surprise me either. I mean, that's where I live. I'm here in Los Angeles, and I see this. I see this all the time. It's not a function of having bad parents or having bad siblings or bad teachers. It's a function of the system requiring so many people in these young people's lives be so spread thin,
Mm-hmm.
overworked, just
That's exactly right.
beat to death, that they can't be present, they can't put the effort in that they probably desperately want to put the effort into. People don't choose to neglect. People don't choose
Mm-hmm.
to, it's a system, and it just keeps churning.
Yes. Yes. If you're a teacher and you see 150 students a day, yeah, you can have relationships with a few, but not many. Like, that's
Yeah.
overwhelming. And in that kind of school setting, kids may feel anonymous too. And so then they don't engage in relationship building in the way that they might. But it's just so crucial that we do more to shift the structure of our schools and ultimately our society to prioritize real relationship building.
How much of this do you think, though, does come down to our I mean, I hate to put it this way, but it ebbs and flows with different administrations. But we are a capitalist society. We're a capitalist socialist society, right? We have tons of social programs, but depending on the administration, we sort of lean more in one direction and more in another, and the hybridization kind of algorithm changes. And I guess, and maybe this is my naive view, but I worry that when we go more laissez faire, when we go more deregulation, kind of classic, not classic, actually, it's not the classic capitalism at all. It's, I think, a very twisted view of capitalism. But when we go more in that direction, and we treat everything like it needs to have a monetary value and a short-term ROI, then that's when we start to forget about externalized costs, but also externalized gains. It's when we forget about long-term investment and how putting money into education. I mean, my view is like education, healthcare, there's like a handful of things
Yeah,
that like just we should just have access to. Like that's what our tax dollars should be paying for. But do you think
that's right.
it's a function of that kind of ideology that like no, a person is worthwhile only if they can produce X number of widgets, and like it's a very simple view of the world, but I think it's very detrimental.
Yes. Look, this is going to be really nerdy, but I really love the Rawls worldview. He was a philosopher, had this idea that in the original position, like if you didn't know how your life was going to turn out, but you had like you were sort of had the intellectual you're sort of the intellectual spirit separated from your actual life conditions. So you didn't know how it was going to turn out, but you understood how the world worked. What people would agree to in the original position is, yes, we need competition and capitalism and the ability for folks to do better through their innovation and hard work. But we would also have a floor that was a reasonable quality of life. And he had this idea that you would, in a sense, constrain how much the winners would get in that competition based on whether or not it was still generating a benefit for all.
Yeah, I love
And
that.
I really liked how he thought about the way we could structure a society. And I think most people would agree to that. Most people, regardless of party, would say, yeah, I don't want to be in a society where people starve in the street
Of course.
or where people have a, have uh, no way to get their prescriptions without, eating cat food, right? Like people would say, no, I want to be in a society that treats my fellow humans decently. And I think most people would agree that, like, yeah, if you come up with a brilliant idea, great, you should make more money. But maybe you shouldn't have all the money.
Right. And definitely you shouldn't be taking the money from this person over here who's working really hard.
Mm-hmm.
And every developed country uses a model similar to this. I mean, that's the thing.
Right,
It's not that
right.
like we've seen it in practice all the time. I actually have a friend, he's a physician in Australia. And don't get me wrong, Australia is not perfect, right? Australia has its issues too. But he reached out to me once after watching some debate or something early on. And he was like, I'm just so confused, Kara, because in your country, are there not people who are so sick or so unwell that they just simply cannot contribute economically to society, like somebody with a profound mental illness or a profound cognitive disturbance, like what do you do with those people? And I was like, oh, they're homeless. Like that's how our society is structured, and it's horrific, but that's the reality. The
Yes.
social programs that you speak of, Medicare, Medicaid, here in California, Medi-Cal, basic access to public education, libraries, fire departments, these systems that we are paying for. Our tax dollars pay for them, yet still, even with all of this hard work put in place, it's being actively dismantled, and it's just not enough.
That's right. That's right. And again, this goes to me to, like, what is the vision of the society we want to have? And if you dig into the vision that says, let's dismantle all of government, in service of what? And then you think about what that society looks like. It's pretty terrible.
Yeah. And how does it rebuild except on, at the whims of billionaires?
Yes.
And I guess that's, I'm curious when how do I put this? You came into your position as Secretary of Education, inheriting a system as it stood, and you had to work within the confines of your power and the negotiations and the relationships that you had to,
Mm-hmm.
let's say, improve or sharpen or whatever word you want to use, just to work within the system that you had and to make it just as much better as you could or as functional as you could, knowing that you couldn't reinvent the wheel, but also knowing that you could kind of come out of office with having put in more than you started. But let's say we waved a magic wand and there was just a surplus budget during the Obama years, like such a surplus budget that
Mm-hmm.
it was like, hey, John, guess what? You get to completely change education in America, and you get to sort of switch around how our tax funding goes towards educational efforts. We got a new chunk. We cut funding to the military and we put it over here in education.
Mm-hmm.
What are you going to do with it? Are you a proponent of kind of universal higher education? Would you like to see college be free for anybody who wants to go?
Yeah. We proposed that in the Obama administration, free community college, and
Oh,
we couldn't get Congress to do it.
of course not. Oh, that's so infuriating. So even the first 2 years, because I can tell you, a lot of people who didn't go to community college would go to community college and get at
Right.
least those 2 years.
Yes, yes. And we need nurses, we need um, technicians to work in advanced manufacturing. Like, there's a lot of jobs that are unfilled today that
Yeah.
could be filled if people had access to a 2-year degree. And I think it's short-sighted that we don't make that investment.
Oh, I agree 100%. Also, like, I had to get a PhD to do my job. I went to a state school for my undergrad, but my first year I went to community college. If it was free, I would have gone the first 2 years to community college, and then my undergrad degree would have been half off.
Right.
Like
Exactly.
that's the thing. You can start
Exactly.
a bachelor's in community college.
That's exactly right. If people who have a lot of money want to still go to expensive private institution for all 4 years, God bless. But we ought to make the foundation, community college, available to everybody. And we could, we have the resources to do it. We just don't prioritize that.
And so when you guys proposed it during the during your tenure, you not only just said, "Hey, here's an idea." You said, "This is also how it's going to be funded, and look, we can do this. It's not going to make
Yes.
the cuts are not
Yes.
going to harm anybody. Like we've got the money, we're ready to go." And they were just like, "No, we need to buy one more, fighter jet or something." Like,
Exactly.
oh, that's
Exactly.
so
Exactly.
infuriating.
Exactly. And ironically, we were able to point to Tennessee, a red state with a
Mhm.
conservative governor at the time, Bill Haslam, that was doing it. And so we were able to say, like, this isn't a Democratic idea or a Republican idea. It's just a good idea to help America. And we couldn't get there. And that was very disappointing. Um, and I hope eventually the politics will shift, that we will be able to get there.
I mean, it may happen. I think one of the things when I'm despairing that I think about is, Dr. King, the other Dr. King's quote about, the moral arc of the universe being long, but bending towards justice. I think
Hmm.
about the thing that brings me hope in this era of just abject fear and chaos and like authoritarian power grab is that this is a direct reaction to Obama. Like, this is what happens when we have progress. Those who feel that progress takes away from them personally, they come out swinging and they come out angry and they do everything they can to try to claw that progress back. And I think that these pendulums sometimes feel like they're swinging wildly. The waves feel very big in one direction and in the other, but it is a direct response to that death grip on power that the folks who are who are dismantling our government right now are trying to do. My hope is that they are not in the grand scheme of things successful, but we are going to be scarred from this for many, many years. We know that. There's no getting around that. But I
No
guess
question.
my question is, in those moments where you propose, universal public education at the community college level, and then you just could not get it passed. I mean, this is a huge blow, right? Let's step away from what's happening today, because that's a separate issue. But even in that moment where you were dealt this huge blow, how did you? Because I think this is the $1 million question for everybody right now. How did you stay motivated? How did you prevent yourself from falling into cynicism and
Mm.
from, developing that classical, like, learned helplessness that's like, no matter what I do, it's never going to happen. So I might as well not try, which is such a, I don't want to say it's just a like negative heuristic or like mental template. There are psych studies that show animals fall into learned helplessness. Like, it's a natural reaction. So we have to actively work not to feel that way. I'm curious about I don't know, your
Yeah, that's a
path.
great question. Two things. One, and I've done this throughout my career, I always try to find the bright spots. It's
Mm-hmm.
very valuable to go and see stuff that is really good. And so, I'd go to a part of the country where there was a phenomenal career and technical education program where students were getting on a path to a great job and were super excited about it. Or I'd go see um, an early childhood classroom where kids are getting the academic foundations and also the love and nurturing and support that is going to allow them to thrive later in their education. Like, you go and you see a thing and it reminds you that even amidst lots of frustration, there are places where great things are happening. Mm-hmm. And if we could scale those, we could accomplish so much. Bill Clinton had this thing he would say, there's nothing wrong with America that can't be fixed by what's right with America. Mm-hmm. And I had that view about education. Like, there's no challenge that we're facing that can't be addressed by the great things that are happening in pockets around the country. So that was one strategy. And the other strategy was to try to find places where you could still put points on the board, where you could make incremental progress. One example of that, we wanted to reverse the ban on Pell Grants that was put in place as part of the '94 crime bill for people who are incarcerated. As you know, Pell Grants are the way that we help low-income people pursue higher education. In the '94 crime bill, because it was the tough on crime era and super punitive, there was a decision to take away the ability of folks who are incarcerated to get Pell Grants. And so it meant that overnight, hundreds of prison higher education programs closed. It's terrible public policy.
Yeah, it's horrible. It's like, let's take the people who most need this kind of support and rehabilitation. Mm-hmm. And it's well, okay. Anyway,
yeah, it's just dumb, right? Like So we wanted to reverse that and restore access to Pell Grants for students who are incarcerated. But we couldn't get Congress to do it. So we figured out that we could use our experimental authority under the Higher Education Act to create a pilot program allowing some colleges and universities to use Pell Grants for incarcerated students as like a demonstration project. Mm-hmm. And so we launched that with 65 colleges and universities. And the programs are amazing. When you talk to the students, you see how education can just transform a life so powerfully and have ripples in their family and community. I remember talking to a guy at Sing Sing who said to me, this is the first time in my life I've had moral credibility with my family. And so by funding that initial set of programs, we set a process in motion that after we left, in the next administration, there actually was a bipartisan coalition in Congress and Pell ban was repealed. And it was partly getting members of Congress and governors and opinion makers to go and visit these pilot programs and to see and to talk with folks and to hear the difference that they're making. So, that, like, we planted a seed that then, folks were able to water, and that turned into progress. So you have to, I think, in these dark moments, try to find where's the place where I could plant some seeds of positivity.
And I love the way that you phrased that, because I guess sort of the last question that I have for you, because I've already kept you so long, and I mean, I could talk to you all day, but you probably couldn't talk to me all day. The last question that comes up for me requires a little bit of explanation. This may feel unrelated, but in some ways it's related to what you just said and then to my next question. I am reminded of the famous quote by Dan Savage, and I've mentioned this before on the show, when he said, during the darkest days of the AIDS crisis, we buried our friends in the morning, we protested in the afternoon, and we danced all night. And then he said, the dance kept us in the fight because it was the dance we were fighting for. It didn't look like we were going to win, and then we did. It doesn't feel like we're going to win now, but we could keep fighting and keep dancing. Not only does this to me speak to this question of how do you not lose hope, right? How do you not fall into despair? But it also brings me to an important question that I think you are perfectly positioned to, I guess, pontificate on, which is the value and the power of not just what we think of as core fundamental academic endeavor. I'm a scientist, and I study the humanities, and we know that these things are important to make widgets and to compete on a global scale. But what about arts education? What about these aspects of the educational experience for both children and adults that is always the first to go? Big Bird is under threat. PBS, like, Frontline is my favorite television show on TV. I am obsessed with it. I've seen every episode that I have ever had access to. If Frontline goes away, my life will be less rich. I just know this. Like, I have friends who are artists, who are musicians, and if they hadn't been exposed at a very early age to the, I don't know, the perspective on the world that they got from their arts education teachers, I don't know if that would have happened. So I'm curious. You oversaw the department. The department includes things that we don't think of as, quote, core subjects. They are just as important, are they not?
It's an excellent point. I think as we think about this question of, what do we want society to be like, there's also the question of, like, what is the good life? What is it that we're aspiring to? And I believe good life, a fulfilling life, includes appreciation and enjoyment of arts and music, beauty, physical beauty of nature. And one of the things we tried to do in the Obama administration was to try to broaden the definition of educational excellence. Like, of course, you need fundamental reading and math skills, and we should never compromise on that. But that's necessary, not sufficient for true educational excellence. And true educational excellence would, of course, include science and social studies and civics and music and art and languages and opportunities to experience and be in nature. And I don't think we got as far on that effort as I would have liked. Some of the legislation that we were able to get done towards the end of the administration was intended to set up this path to, as a country, move to a more well-rounded vision of what education should look like. But then, of course, everything changed with the 2016 election, and many of those things that had bipartisan support kind of went by the way.
But we continue, and that is one thing that is fundamental to our governmental system and structure, and that I still hold out hope cannot be dismantled
Mm-hmm.
at this time, and that is that we will have another election.
Yes.
Like,
Yes.
they
Yes.
we will be able to change the composition of the legislature in a year and a half. We will be able
Mm-hmm.
to, make a decision as a nation about what matters to us at the executive level in 3.5 years. And no matter what he says, we will have another election. We do have term limits in this country.
Mm-hmm.
And we can, even if we made mistakes, we can change course.
100%.
I cannot thank you enough, John, not just for obviously your service to this country, but for taking the time now to sit down, to write this book and share about your own personal journey, but of course to, I think, inspire those of us who are listening right now, but also the readers of the book, the importance of mentorship, the importance of serving our institutions and our social systems. And thank you for taking an hour out of your day to chat with us. It was really meaningful conversation.
Thank you for a wonderful conversation, and thank you for the community that you've created through this podcast.
Oh,
We need more of that.
Oh, thanks for saying that. Everybody, the book is Teacher by Teacher, The People Who Change Our Lives by Dr. John B. King Jr. And everybody, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk.